And this will basically be what we're doing in tomorrow's program.
Yeah.
We're not gonna go inside the fort for the most part. We're gonna use the island itself with Cannon Row, and then we're gonna use the viewpoint toward the harbor at the beach, and
that's great.
That'll pretty much be it.
Well, if you're doing the way you kind of just did that was great. I think we could even do that tomorrow, and I can kind of, I definitely will do the reading if that's all right.
Yeah, for sure.
And and I like to kind of tag team it, and if you don't mind that, that's sometimes
some give and take. Yeah, sure. What we could do on the way by is we could kind of acknowledge that sign's here to discuss like what we just talked about.
Yeah.
And then kind of and I'll have to look again at exactly what I put down for Kaylee, but use this to kind of transition into the escapees story. If you wanted to, let me see if one thing you could read is the Jacob Stroyer account.
This history, human beings were being brought here, transported, that's like we just said, to Charleston, the harbor area, the life of enslavement here in the United States under, at some point even under this flag. Because everybody, I mean, all three of you are so passionate about what you're feeling the visitors are getting out of it.
Yes.
And if we can get that across on this, that would be great.
If you could handle the flag lowering, that would be awesome. And then I'll come over and do the locking up in a few minutes. Yep.
Well, thanks very much for joining us today, Kaylee. I really want to just begin by asking you what inspired you to commit so much time and effort in researching and developing and sharing the stories of freedom seekers.
Yeah, so I've been in and around the National Park Service for the past 9 years. I've always been really drawn to stories of resistance, stories of individuals who fought for their civil liberties and civil rights. This national park site is dedicated to two main stories: the American Revolution and the American Civil War. Now, any park ranger that you talk to would be able to say that we spend a lot of time researching and reading. And I had a lot of catching up to do in terms of really better understanding the Civil War at large. I was somebody who was a little bit hesitant about it. I didn't think that I would ever really be able to connect fully with the 19th century. But once I started to uncover and understand these stories of people who literally risked their lives to seek freedom, that completely changed my view on the Civil War and how to approach it and how we talk to visitors about this. In 2020, the world was faced with a global pandemic, and our national park sought meaningful ways to not only connect with the public better, but also we had a dedicated team of volunteers who were wanting to help us from home. And so staff started looking at the National Archives and Records Administration, ways to improve information on our park website, and get some projects done at the house. This led to the discovery of the Confederate Quartermaster records. Here in Charleston Harbor, we have the documents for Fort Moultrie, Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter, the defenses in Mount Pleasant, Battery Wagner on Morris Island. Now, these documents are very specific. They're tracking the compensation of people in the area. General Order number 138 begins to allow the conscription, the forced use of black labor on various military sites. These individual enslaving people are receiving compensation for that slave labor being leased out for the Confederate military. They were paid for this, the enslaver, not the enslaved person themselves. And so as a result, all of this information was tracked, right? This is government expenditure that the Confederacy is keeping receipts on. They're tracking how long individuals were leased to different sites and what type of work they were doing, who their enslavers were, right? Now, at the end of some of these records, there is an additional ledger that they could provide remarks or notes on. The term ran away is used. And between 1863 and 1864, the term ran away is used 248 times on the defenses of Sullivan's Island. Because somebody found those individual documents, we now understand and can proudly tell people that over 248 individual freedom seekers escaped their bondage here on Sullivan's Island. That's adding so much more to our stories of the Civil War, themes of resistance, standing up for civil rights, individuals who proudly fought to be Americans today.
And so my role was to take the source documents and actually put them all into a spreadsheet so they could be preserved. To actually see the records and see the names, you could get you can get choked up, of what they were doing, and you can only imagine the actual work. People got hospitalized, people died just doing this. So that's all part of the struggle. I think it has a large impact on the visitors. Frankly, a lot of visitors come to Fort Sumter because it is the first site of the first battle of the Civil War. But when we're actually at the site itself and you see the millions of bricks that were taken to do that, and then especially the fingerprints that are still in those bricks that we can show to the visitors, I think really is very impactful.
The night of May 12th of 1862, Robert Smalls and about 15 other people were aboard the ship, the Planter, which was a Confederate contractor ship that brought supplies through Charleston Harbor. And seeing that the Confederate officers who ordinarily were on that ship had skipped their homework and gone into Charleston for the night, they saw the opportunity of a lifetime to make an escape from slavery. From what we call the Southern Wharf here down at near the bottom of the city of Charleston, up to the North Atlantic Wharf to pick up the family members, and from the North Atlantic Wharf, they can sail through this harbor, past Castle Pinckney, past Confederate defenses on James Island, like Fort Johnson, where the Civil War's first shots were fired, and past Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie. One of the crewmen, a man named Alfred Gourdine, is going to write later that we all knew that Fort Sumter was the chief obstacle on our way, that it was the center of Confederate power in this harbor. It was extremely well armed, and that the sailors there were used to seeing the Planter, so they had to trick them. Robert Smalls, he writes, gave the correct whistle signals, and the Confederates themselves backed this up in their writings, to make it past Fort Sumter. He also wore the captain's hat as a silhouette to disguise himself in the dark. It was tough to see the people's faces, and the Confederates bought the ruse hook, line, and sinker. Once they did that, they could make it into this main shipping channel and make it out to the USS Onward.
Each of our national park sites, we have enabling legislations that really kind of dictate initially maybe the core stories under which those sites were established. But as time goes on, the realization, luckily, has been that there are more stories, broader stories that are connected to these sites, and also to the significance of not only the stories that are told there, but how those stories contribute to our national history.
I'm incredibly honored to have been part of a team of people, both staff and volunteers, over 2 decades in the making, to add Fort Moultrie to the list of one of over 800 designations now. That on January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, slavery is not going to be legally abolished in the United States of America until after the 13th Amendment is going to be ratified near the end of 1865. This is after the Civil War is over. But the proclamation did result in momentum, movement, hope for the enslaved population. It was the beginning of those steps towards a more free and equal society. It was very specific. In the Emancipation Proclamation, it states that all persons held as slaves within rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. And so after the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, we see a major movement and a major spike in freedom seeker activity happen literally across the continent. Shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation is passed, we also see the official creation of the Bureau of Colored Troops. And for the first time, for the US military, both the Army and Navy, they began to allow the official enlistment of Black men into the US Armed Forces. In just those last 2.5 years of Civil War, we see over 200,000 Black men proudly wear one of the US military uniforms to fight not only for themselves and their future, but for the futures of their loved ones, their friends, their family, and I argue for our futures that we're experiencing right now today. In the summer of 1863, things are really heating up here in Charleston Harbor. The US Navy begins attacking the Confederate-occupied forts, Fort Moultrie, Fort Sumter, Battery Wagner. They're being bombarded for about an 18-month period. These US naval officers, their ships, they're right across the harbor. The finish line is literally in sight. And it's crazy to believe that freedom was right across the harbor in the very same city where the Civil War began. These documents are literally just the tip of the iceberg, too. So we have dedicated time, thanks again to our volunteers, for transcribing dozens of the Charleston area related payroll documents, but the National Archives and Records Administration literally has thousands of these documents uploaded, dictating information for almost every Confederate state, different military sites, forts, occupations, roles. So this could lead to other sites being able to discover very similar stories. And maybe their documents too say the word ran away on the end. It's the history of a people who fought to be part of the never-ending march towards a more perfect union. Thank you. And now, thank you so much. I'm going to invite Park Ranger Walt Young to help us learn more about Fort Sumter's connections to the Underground Railroad network to freedom.
During the Civil War, we had both some of our most famous and some forgotten stories of people who managed to use the passage through Charleston Harbor to escape past Fort Sumter and make it to freedom. As President Abraham Lincoln authorizes a blockade of the southern coastline, satirized here as the Great Snake that we now know as the Anaconda Plan. As this snake wraps around the tendrils of the Confederacy, just getting to the boundaries of the Confederacy, to a United States soldier, can for the first time mean your personal freedom and might change the meaning of the United States flag for you. Here in Charleston Harbor, this is going to be put to the test pretty early in the war. In April of 1862, just a year after the first shots at Fort Sumter, this ship, the USS Bionville, stationed just off of Charleston Harbor near Sullivan's Island and Isle of Palms, received an escape voyage of 15 people on a small, maybe raft, maybe ramshackle boat that they had taken out of Confederate lines. Just 2 weeks after that event, 2 weeks after the end of April 1862, is by far our most famous escape of the Civil War here in Charleston. Probably what you may have come here for today, the story of Robert Smalls. The planter had been filled, in addition to these people, in addition to the military intelligence they kept in their heads, it had been filled with 6 Confederate cannons and it had been filled with supplies that were supposed to go to the buildings of new and existing Confederate batteries here in Charleston Harbor. One of my favorite newspaper records I've ever researched with this park is the Charleston Moultrie from the next day after this event. And their headline for this event is, Confederate paper here in Charleston, "Disgusting treachery and negligence." So they are a little angry at the Confederate officers who allowed this to happen, and they would be brought up on court-martial charges. Of course, in the northern states and among African Americans who can know about this story, Robert Smalls is a true hero. Smalls would go on to serve on the USS Keokuk in the naval attack in April 1863. It was one of the first U.S. attempts to take back Fort Sumter in the Civil War. It did not succeed, but he was more than willing to put himself out there alongside the U.S. Navy. He would sail the Planter in operations up and down this coastline. And in between that, he would go on speaking trips to tell people up in the North about what he had done and maybe inspire African Americans up in the North to join the United States war effort themselves. In 1862, he met with the Lincoln administration, including definitively Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. It's unclear by my research whether he got to meet Abe himself. And about a week after that meeting is when the Secretary of War issued one of the first authorizations for black U.S. troops. So that is going to be the beginning of another phase in our Underground Railroad history, because now you've got more pathways to escape. We see trickles in the official records of this person escaped one day. This person escaped on the 4th of July. That's a real one. By the end of this war, Fort Sumter will be becoming a symbol of, I think, everything we've talked about today. Robert Smalls, after the Civil War, will eventually become one of the first black congressmen in the United States House of Representatives. He would serve in the town and district around Beaufort, South Carolina. In February 1865, about 160 years ago this very week, in about 2 or 3 days, February 17th and 18th, the Confederacy evacuates Charleston for the final time, and United States soldiers march into the city. It'll be members of the 55th Massachusetts Regiment and the 21st USCT marching into those streets to let those local freedmen know that they have friends. A document that had been written in 1776 said that all men are created equal. I think that's the mission statement for this United States flag. And it's Robert Smalls, the other people who escaped during the Civil War, and people like them who helped to make that closer to a reality and to continue those improvements after the American Civil War.
Well, can we hear, first of all, another round of applause to both of these fine interpreters. Indeed. Things that I experienced in taking in both of their presentations, again, was the commitment. It was emotional, both of them. There was conviction. And the things that were expressed. There was joy as well, not only for the stories that are being shared, but the celebration of those freedom seekers and their courage and what those stories represent to us today and will continue forever, forever. This is we'll call them plaques for the day. But it is for your work along with the others, all the others, for submitting a successful application for the Freedom Seeker Stories of Fort Moultrie. So, yeah.
We will go on with our careers. We'll change, we'll see different parks, different sites. But as Ted said, these stories are here forever recorded. And these are stories that truly every American can and should be proud of.
So then for that next year in 2024, I'm just going to present this to you, but for your work along with all the others in submitting, again, a successful application for the freedom seekers and designating and acknowledging the freedom seekers. And the story is tied to Fort Sumter. So.
And I don't think I can top what Kaylee said. So I will leave it at thank you to each and every one of you who came here today. And thank you to our fellow park rangers, our park leadership, and our volunteers who have assisted in this project and who assist in telling these stories every single day. We're going to be talking today about people on the Underground Railroad here in Charleston. At a time in American history when the American flag was changing dramatically in its meaning. And to start off our program, we're going to be going to the back of our property to a time in American history when we had laid out these ideals, but here in this harbor, we might not have been living up to them yet. So we're going to step out these doors and we are going to go to what we call the Bench by the Road Memorial.
Oh, okay.
An estimated 400,000 people were forced to the North American continent. And of those 400,000, about 40%, that 240,000 number, came through the Charleston area first before being sold to enslavers from other states. That means that this particular island is an incredibly important historic site for us to visit and to reference. And we truly have had people from across the globe come here to learn and also to grieve, to experience some pretty raw emotions. People who were forced through slave trade, not all of them made it. We estimate upwards of 30% on those held in bondage did not actually make it here to the New World forcibly. But those who were brought over and did survive that journey stepped off here on Sullivan's Island. In the 1700s, this was the major port of debarkation for the Charleston area, and individuals were held here, both the enslaved and the enslavers would be held in quarantine, the actual word that they used at the time, to make sure that any potential disease would not be brought to the main Charleston downtown population, where these individuals would be sold on auction blocks throughout town. Behind where that family isn't enjoying their picnic now, this really actually shows it happening right before us, the true kind of meaning and the purpose of the bench by the road. Toni Morrison, a very famous poet and writer, she had an interview with a magazine in the 1990s. And she expressed her feelings regarding how we interpret and commemorate those who were affected by slavery here in the United States. And paraphrasing her conversation, she says, "There is no monument, there's no statue, there's no recognition. Heck, there's not even a simple bench by the road, anything commemorating the lives lost during the Middle Passage and slave trade here in this country." And thus launched the Bench by the Road program. Here on Sullivan's Island, we have the pride to have been one of the very first sites to receive a Bench by the Road memorial.
They're learning. Yeah, they are. Yeah, they're learning. They can stay.
Very special thing you're listening to, guys. No, you.
All right.
Very special.
I was about to let them read it. That would be the real stars here. There is no place you or I can go to think about or not think about, to summon the presences of or recollect the absences of slaves. There is no suitable memorial or plaque or wreath or wall or park or skyscraper lobby. There's no 300-foot tower. There's no small bench by the road. There is not even a tree scored, an initial that I can visit or you can visit in Charleston or Savannah or New York or Providence, or better still, on the banks of the Mississippi. And because such a place doesn't exist. The book had to.
You can get a great view of Fort Sumter off in the middle of the harbor. Fort Sumter is 1.1 miles away from us right now. The next closest fort would have been Fort Johnson, at another half a mile or so on the other side on James Island. And so Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter really guard the entrance to Charleston Harbor. And so on the other side of the fort, you could see straight through it, you would be able to see a little bit of that downtown skyline. Even since the very beginning of these forts' history, slave labor was at the root of it. Now, in the 1850s and 60s, we see growing dissent in the United States of America and increasing sectionalism and division amongst the northern and southern states. We see the American Civil War break out right here, April 12th, 1861 at 4:30 in the morning. The first shot of the Civil War was fired from Fort Johnson on James Island towards Fort Sumter. At this time on April 12th, Sumter was the only piece of U.S. territory in the entire harbor. The only place that you could see that American flag, that symbol. Its meaning was changing once again. Here at Fort Moultrie, this would have been Confederate occupied by the time the war began, as well as the other areas of Charleston Harbor. In the middle of the war, both the U.S. and the Confederacy were looking for various ways to turn the tides in their favor. Both of them had very different approaches, but the same realization that they needed to rely on black labor to win the war. With the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, now that those people who are enslaved here know that there is opportunity to seek freedom, this is when we see that movement of freedom seeker activity really increase. And so, for those who were part of the presentation earlier, you may remember we have documented 248 people escaped from Confederate occupation here off of Confederate lines, most likely to attempt to reach one of the U.S. naval ships, maybe an officer's camp on Morris Island or in the surrounding area.
And our final stop will be getting a view of the entire harbor channel from Charleston out to the Atlantic Ocean. So beyond, we'll get a clearer look when we're over there, but it's beyond Fort Sumter. At the battery, most of what was happening there was basically a party among the locals who were exactly right. They did not understand what the war was going to be. See right in front of us the United States flag out at Fort Sumter, and we had a couple people asking about the other islands surrounding it. So beyond it, the dark green line of trees beyond Fort Sumter is mostly part of James Island, which has on it a place called Fort Johnson. That was the origin of the first shot of the Civil War, which was a high arcing shot from a mortar cannon. It would have looked like a big firework. I'm guessing many of you like fireworks, but if I was a US soldier, I would not have liked this one, because this told all the other Confederate positions, including over on Morris Island, where you see that lighthouse, and here on Sullivan's Island at this fort and many of the other positions Kaylee alluded to, and a boat off Sullivan's Island, all pointing at the one US flag in the middle at Fort Sumter. That firing changed American history. It led to the beginning of that deadly Civil War, but it also gave people like the freedom seekers we're talking about today the opportunity to escape past these forts. Robert Smalls and the planter, though they are the most famous example of this, aren't the only people who managed to escape. But in April of 1862, about 2 weeks before the planters' escape, we had a group of 15, as they were known by the US Navy, quote-unquote contrabands, escaping past these forts to make it to US sailors, giving them information about Confederate defenses, and even escaping, at least in one person's case, from a Confederate general named Roswell Ripley. In May of 1862, when Robert Smalls and 15 other people made this journey, they knew, in the words of a man named Alfred Gordine, one of the sailors on the planter, that getting past Fort Sumter was going to be their main obstacle, because the Confederates there could shoot them out of the water. Ted, I invite you to read the full quote from Alfred Gordine in a newspaper article about 30 years after the Civil War.
What we had talked over, and what every man fully realized, was that the real crisis would come when we passed Fort Sumter. We had been down the bay occasionally, and the steamer was well known to all. but we feared that our appearance at such an early hour might excite distrust. When we drew near to the fort, every man but Robert Small felt his knees giving way, and the women began crying and praying again. Small kept the steamer right on her course, and when she was opposite the fort, he saluted with a whistle and added an extra toot as a farewell to the Confederacy.
Yep. In addition to the whistle signals, he wore the captain's hat on the ship he had taken from under their noses in downtown Charleston. And when he reached the USS Onward, he turned over a ship filled with 6 Confederate cannons, filled with Confederate supplies that were supposed to go to building Confederate positions, and all the knowledge that he and the other crewmen had gathered about Confederate defenses in the area. In the following year, Robert Smalls would be here in this harbor again, attacking Fort Sumter with U.S. Navy vessels. And in July of 1863, on Morris Island, you'd see men in blue uniforms, white and black, storming Confederate positions on Morris Island. The fact of his escape may have helped lay the groundwork for the United States' willingness to say, hey, it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. Your blood bleeds the same red for the United States. And in February 1865, 160 years almost to the day this week, the Confederates would clear out all these forts and United States forces would take them back. And it would be black soldiers who would march into the city of Charleston to let the new freedmen know the good news of U.S. victory in this Civil War, and therefore, freedom from slavery. Think about what this U.S. flag, with its 35 stars, meant at the end of the Civil War. That finally, for the people who had done so much to get out of this harbor, who had risked their lives to get out of this harbor just to get to a ship that was flying that flag, for the first time, that flag could now live up to the promise of freedom that was put in our Declaration of Independence.
I learned a lot about the ways that the National Park Service extends its benefits to different entities and to different communities by providing technical support, by providing support for education and interpretation. And I find it really inspiring that the National Park Service is collaborating with communities in many ways to extend its benefits and to become part of communities in new ways beyond the boundaries of the National Park Service sites.
Hearing their stories and hearing the bravery of all the people and just like being able to see it in person between Fort Sumter, Fort Johnson, and James Island and the Upper Peninsula, it's just magnificent that there's people willing to risk swimming through this and how rough this was for a better life. And it just it really almost brings a tear to my eye to think that people are willing to do that. And it's just so inspirational to see it, be here, stand on the ground, that many brave people risked everything to continue the American experiment. So it's just a beautiful place to witness and hear it from these amazing experts and just to see it and their passion for it and everything.
I think what really inspired me today was the excitement of the Rangers, the importance of going further than just saying, well, we're a national park site and we're interpreting, and this is an important part of what we're interpreting. But beyond that, that you're taking it into a whole network. There are places all over the country. When I first saw the map of all the way up into the upper Midwest and California, and I just was astounded. So I feel like I've taken a lot of what I knew from book knowledge and had it really shown to me in a very impactful way.
I really don't know, this half of it. I mean, I'm up in New England, it's a whole nother story. So learning how people, what they did here and getting on the boats and the water and, you know, even looking at the maps you had showing the routes that they did to come up. I mean, these are things I'm still learning. And this is sort of the start. And I'm up near, sort of near the end if they were getting up to Canada or wherever they were going. So very cool.
Historians estimate somewhere around 240,000 individuals were trafficked through the Charleston area before being sold to enslavers in other states. And so we have people from across the globe who have this awareness of the history, it's very difficult history, that our park has. This is a way that we can kind of talk about that difficult history, but bring a little bit of light to it as well. Yes, people were forced to come here in bondage, but people were willing to risk their lives to break from that bondage on this very same island. And so it helps to provide a more complete experience and picture of the experience of enslaved people.
When Congress made our park a National Historical Park in 2019, they specifically wrote out that we are supposed to be telling the stories of the soldiers of Fort Sumter and the battles at Fort Sumter, but also of the people who helped build Fort Sumter, of the people who came into the United States for the first time here near Sullivan's Island, and I think then by extension, the people who used the Civil War to make an escape from slavery. So this is something that we are required to do by the law, and it's something that every day as an interpreter, I have no regrets that we continue doing. I think that having a network of places to tell these stories is important to putting the pieces together. I think my entire journey through Civil War parks as an interpreter on a big scale is kind of just adding pieces to a Civil War puzzle of how this war unfolded and how it changed what it means to be an American. And the freedom seeker stories, I think, are one piece of that puzzle in themselves, and through the journeys that people took across the country, which is a famous and inextricable part of the Underground Railroad, they are a part of our story that really can help people trace that as they travel and learn.
Just simply having the Network to Freedom designation on our website, in our materials, our printed brochures, the plaques at our visitor centers now, it sparks a conversation. Stereotypically, people think of Harriet Tubman when they think of the Underground Railroad. And so they often ask, was Harriet Tubman here at the fort? And so it provides us the opportunity to really help better educate people on the broad scale of the Underground Railroad and the activity that we see literally across the continent. So Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter are now part of over 800 individual designations across the United States that are highlighted by the Network to Freedom.